Welcome back to the Psyche and Singularity series. I'm going over my book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. In this video, I will be comparing Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory cosmology to Plato's cosmology in the Republic. And I will also be showing how this is a response to Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit, which I briefly discuss in the book Psyche and Singularity. But in this video, I'm going to elaborate a little more on that because I just think it's an opportunity to show the importance of these parallels between string theory and Plato's cosmology. It's interesting from an academic perspective, but according to Al Gore's thinking, as I'll be discussing, it could also help resolve the spiritual crisis that he says is at the root of the ecological crisis. In his book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit, Al Gore very clearly blames Plato for the current crisis, the environmental crisis, because Plato, he says, taught us that the soul is separate from the body, and that we should seek to rise above the material world into the ethereal reaches of space using our intellect, our disembodied intellect. And so if we're separate from the body and the material world, then we don't feel a spiritual kinship with it, and that causes us to treat it like a commodity. And I'll quote some of the passages from from Al Gore's book. And the irony is that Al Gore's proposed antidote to the Platonic disease of seeing ourselves as separate from nature is actually the acme of Plato's philosophy, which is presented in the Cave Allegory of the Republic. It is to see the idea of the good, which is the spiritual sun, of which the visible sun is a shadowy reflection with the mind's eye. And Al Gore says we should see God everywhere in the universe like a hologram, located at each point, just like in a holographic film plate. All of the information of the whole three-dimensional image is located at each point of the holographic film. Though if you were to break that film and shine a laser through just one fragment, the whole image would still appear, though with less resolution. So Al Gore believes that understanding God's presence in nature as a hologram is the solution to Plato. What I'm going to be discussing in this video is that Plato's cosmology is inherently amenable to this holographic interpretation, and the parallels between Gore's antidote to Plato and Plato's highest image of philosophy are uncanny, and it's ironic. It's also ironic in the same way that Leonard Susskind's supposed antidote to the kind of spiritual cosmology Plato presents is, again, it's practically a point-for-point recreation of Plato's cosmology. So that's a lot of information. In the previous video, I showed the parallels between Plato's cosmology and the Timaeus and Susskind's holographic string theory, and I showed how Xing-Tung Yao, Harvard mathematician who co-discovered the Calabi-Yau manifolds, which are very important to string theory, how he points out many parallels between the Timaeus and string theory. And he says we should look to Plato for the future progress of string theory. He did not point out the parallels between the Cave Allegory and string theory, which are the most pronounced, and nor did he point out the parallels between the idea in the Timaeus of the mother substance, the cosmic horizon as the mother substance, that the intermediatrix between the material three-dimensional forms and the absolute eternal forms, which are eternally existing. The outermost sphere of the universe, according to Plato's cosmology in the Timaeus, absorbs all of the material created things like a mother and gives birth to them at the same time. I discussed that in the previous video. So with that image in mind of the Timaeus, with God putting a soul in the central point of the cosmos, which permeates the volume of space and encompasses the outermost sphere, that's the cosmology in the Timaeus. If you combine that with the cosmology in the Republic, and you really have a dead ringer for Susskind's cosmology. You get the threads radiating all of the information from the past, present, and future from the horizon inward. You have that in the myth of the near-death experience recounted at the end of the Republic. and the idea of the outermost sphere being the holographic film that projects these three-dimensional objects that we experience, including our own bodies and everything we see, that you find in the Cave Allegory. And you don't need to take my word on it. It's much better if you take Brian Greene's word on it, Columbia University physicist and great advocate of Susskind's, a string theorist, a great educator. So here's what he has to say in his book, The Fabric of the Cosmos. He says, whereas Plato envisioned common perceptions as revealing a mere shadow of reality, the holographic principle concurs, but turns the metaphor on its head. The shadows, the things that are flattened out and hence live on a lower dimensional surface, are real, while what seem to be the more richly structured higher dimensional entities, us, the world around us, are evanescent projections of the shadows. While it is a fantastically strange idea, and one whose role in the final understanding of space-time is far from clear, 't Hooft and Susskind's so-called holographic principle is well motivated. He gives a richer endorsement of their theory elsewhere when he says, of all the theories discussed here, I'd pick the holographic principle as the one most likely to play a dominant role in future research. And then in another book, The Hidden Reality, Greene says, again, comparing string theory, holographic string theory to Plato's Cave Allegory, he says, two millennia later, it seems that Plato's cave may be more than a metaphor. To turn his suggestion on its head, reality, not its mere shadow, may take place on a distant boundary surface, while everything we witness in the three common spatial dimensions is a projection of that faraway unfolding. Reality, that is, may be akin to a hologram or really a holographic movie. He goes on to say, if we could understand the laws that govern physics on that distant surface, the cosmic horizon, and the way phenomena there link to experience here, we would grasp all there is to know about reality. So what he said there, comparing Plato's Cave Allegory to holographic string theory, mirrors what Plato himself says. If we could understand what happens at the outermost horizon of the cosmos and how it's related to the three-dimensional objects we perceive here, we would understand all there is to know. And all there is to know is condensed in the ultimate idea of the good, which is the pinnacle of Plato's Cave Allegory. So, to make a little more sense out of what Brian Greene said there, he says, string theory concurs with Plato's Cave Allegory, but turns it on its head. He says, these three-dimensional objects that we inhabit, just like Plato said, they're an illusion, but what Brian Greene is pointing out is, yeah, but the illusion is projected from a flat two-dimensional surface at the spherical horizon of the cosmos, which seems to invert Plato's theory that three-dimensional forms are a shadow of higher dimensional forms. Instead, it seems the three-dimensional forms are projections from a two-dimensional surface. So that's reversing Plato's analogy. I'm going to explain how that does not reverse Plato's analogy, but it teaches us how to rotate the eye of the soul in such a way as to understand that our true selves are not these material bodies, but that our true selves are one with the self of the universe, which is at the center of every observer's point of view. So for us, it's here in the center of my consciousness and at the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. That's the true self. That's where we really are, and we are projecting these three-dimensional forms into existence. So if you rotate the eye of the soul, you'll see yourself not as these bodies, but as out at the horizon of the cosmos, which is where Carl Jung felt himself to be when he had his near-death experience, and which is where we'll see the soldier named in Plato's myth of went when he said he left his body. And so if we rotate the eye of the soul and see ourselves not here as these material forms, but as out at the horizon and at the centralmost point of the cosmos, wherever you happen to be is the centralmost point of the cosmos from your perspective, because space is expanding away from each of us at an exponential rate. That holographic string theory teaches us how to rotate the eye of the soul in such a way as to see our true relationship to the natural world, which is that we are interwoven with all of the information of the natural world, specifically at the cosmic horizon, from which all of nature radiates inward. So we are one with nature. Contrary to Al Gore's belief, Plato's cosmology does not teach us that we hover above nature. It teaches us rather that all of nature and each of us is interwoven at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, where the past, present, and future coexist, and that fundamental threads of destiny project these three-dimensional forms into existence. Having said that, I will first break down Plato's Cave Allegory very briefly, and then I will read a little bit from Earth in the Balance and show how Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory satisfies Plato's Cave Allegory and Al Gore's call for this new spiritual cosmology. So from Al Gore's book, I'll start. This is from his 1992 edition on page 249. He says, for example, throughout the first 5 centuries of Christianity, the heresy of Gnosticism, which portrayed physical reality as an illusion, drew powerfully upon Plato's conception of a disembodied spiritual intellect hovering above the material world. But even after this Gnostic view was formally rejected, it periodically resurfaced in various guises, and the Platonic assumption upon which it was based, that man is separate from the world of nature, continued to flourish as a major strain of Christian thought. Okay, while reading that, I realized that first I wanted to summarize Plato's Cave Allegory, but with that in mind, here's Plato's Cave Allegory. In the Republic, Plato depicts his martyred mentor Socrates speaking to Plato's brothers Glaucon and Adimantas, and he's describing to them our position in the universe. They're trying to develop an ideal society. What is justice? The goal is to find justice in the individual soul. To help with that task, Socrates suggests, well, let's develop in our minds the ideally just society, which would be like a magnified version of the individual soul. If we blow it up larger, justice will be easier to find in the larger model of the city-state, and then we can extrapolate back to finding justice in the individual soul. So in that context, he tells the story of the cave allegory. He says, now imagine prisoners who at the moment of birth are taken to an underground cave, and they're shackled head to foot and forced to look at the back wall of the cave. They can't turn their heads to the left or the right. All they see is the back wall. Behind them, above the entrance of the cave, is a blazing fire. And in between the prisoners and the fire is a wall, a partition, behind which, and the side facing the fire at the entrance of the cave, guards carry up on sticks silhouettes, two-dimensional cutouts, puppet forms of natural objects from outside the cave, like trees and rabbits or what have you. The fire casts the shadow of these puppets onto the back wall. So the prisoners see these shadows of the puppets. They also see their own shadows. They can see their neighbors' shadows and their own shadow of their own body. So Socrates says, since they've never seen anything else, wouldn't they assume that's reality? Yes, they would. Okay, so imagine now someone coming down out of the upper world, releasing a prisoner, turning his head and saying, look, this is reality, or at least more real than these shadows. Wouldn't that prisoner's eyes be hurt by the blazing fire? And they wouldn't really be able to see anything. The guards or the puppets, they just see blinding light. And they would think the shadows were more real than what they're being shown now. Yes, so that is agreed to. Now imagine that prisoner being hauled up the rough ascent out into the outer world. The sun will blind them much worse than the fire did. So at first they'll have to look at things at nighttime. Then during the day they can look at objects in reflections on puddles of water. Finally, they'll be able to look at things in the broad daylight, and the ultimate vision, they'll be able to catch a fleeting glimpse of the sun itself. Then they'll realize the sun is the source of all these physical objects, which are themselves the original patterns of which the puppets in the shadowy cave are reflections. So the sun, he'll realize, is the real source of being. And now the prisoner's told, go back into the cave and return the favor of your release by releasing another prisoner. So when he goes back, at first he's blinded again by the darkness. He's not used to seeing the shadows. The prisoners are not impressed with him because he can't predict which shadow will come first. That's the game they pride themselves on. I think that's an allusion to astronomy in this allegory, but I'll continue this cave allegory. But eventually the returning prisoner's eyes adjust to the shadows. He can see the shadows clearly again. He can predict which shadow will come before which because he can look around and see the guards are picking up which puppets. So 10,000 times more accurately, he can predict these shadow patterns. And he tells the people, this is a cave, you're shackled up, all you see is shadows. Why don't you see the real world? Before his eyes were adjusted, the people would rather kill him than allow them to make them as blind and insane as he appears to be. So it's a dangerous mission, and Socrates leaves it at that. So the allegory is, as the shadows in the cave, on the back wall of the cave, are in relation to the three-dimensional objects we see outside of the cave, so are those three-dimensional objects, our bodies, trees, the physical world, like shadows of higher dimensional absolute ideal forms. So the trees we perceive are like shadows or dream projections of the absolute idea of a tree. And similarly, when we deal in the law courts and we seek justice, the justice of our world is like a dim reflection or shadow of the absolute idea of justice. And all of the absolute ideas are contained in the ultimate idea of the good, of which the visible sun is a shadowy reflection. And then Socrates says, you have to see this idea of the good with the eye of the soul to be able to act prudently in public or in private life. So I am equating the idea of the good in the cave allegory with the singularity. In the book Psyche and Singularity, I equate the gravitational singularity with Carl Jung's concept, or his definition of the psyche. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. That was Carl Jung's equation. The highest intensity of energy is infinite. The smallest space is zero volume. That's the definition of a gravitational singularity. It also resembles greatly Plato's idea of the good. If we compare this back to the Timaeus, it's the central point, the soul of the universe, which permeates the volume of space and also contains the outermost periphery, the mother substance. That's what Timaeus, the astronomer, tells Socrates in that dialogue. He calls it the mother substance. The past, the present, and the future are all contained in this outermost sphere and project the visible objects that we perceive in like a mother. So if you combine the Timaeus, which is the spherical cosmology with the central point, and the cosmology of the Republic, you really have a very close model of Susskind's holographic string theory, which can be easily combined with Carl Jung's near-death experience, where he perceived himself to rise above his body, and it seemed to him as if each of us is interwoven at the horizon of the cosmos with the past, the present, and the future, and that we're all hung up in a box, in a three-dimensional box. This is where our material existence is like a little box hung up to the horizon by a thread. So that was the original parallel that keyed me into these similarities between Jung's psychology and Susskind's string theory. So this image of the holographic string theory and the parallel with Plato's cave allegory, I read from Brian Greene, who says that the string theory turns Plato's cave allegory on its head, but not really. What it really does is help us turn the eye of the soul to see our true position as not only here in the central observatory point of the universe, but also out at the horizon of the cosmos. If we see ourselves out there, as Jung did during his near-death experience, then we will see that the holographic string theory does not turn the string theory on its head. We just have to turn our own inner heads around and see our true positions out at the horizon and at the central point. And that means, moreover, that we're interwoven with all of nature, which is a response to Al Gore. So returning to his book, the first quote that I read is that he said Christianity was basically corrupted by Plato's theory, that we're separate from the natural world, that we rise above it. He goes on to say, as on page 220 of his book, the cleavage in the modern world between mind and body, man and nature, has created a new kind of addiction. I believe that our civilization is, in effect, addicted to the consumption of the earth itself. The addictive relationship distracts us from the pain of what we have lost, a direct experience of our connection to the vividness, vibrancy, and aliveness of the rest of the natural world. And he says that we lost this connection because of Plato, who was then fused with Christianity, and this separation of the soul from nature that Plato started reached its culmination in Cornell Gore in René Descartes' philosophy, which was combined with Francis Bacon's scientific method, which really united to create a very destructive worldview, environmentally destructive worldview, which sees the world as a machine made of parts with no soul. So I will now turn to that. So he says, we are not used to seeing God in the world because we assume from the scientific and philosophical rules that govern us that the physical world is made up of inanimate matter whirling in accordance with mathematical laws and bearing no relation to life, much less ourselves. Why does it feel faintly heretical to a Christian to suppose that God is in us as human beings? Why do our children believe that the kingdom of God is up, somewhere in the ethereal reaches of space far removed from this planet? Are we still unconsciously following the direction of Plato's finger, looking for the sacred everywhere except in the real world? So right there, that's a reference to Raphael's Renaissance painting, The School of Athens. In the middle of the painting, an older Plato is pointing up towards the sun, and next to him, a younger student of his, Aristotle, is motioning his hand out towards the earth. Plato's pointing towards the idea of the good, the spiritual sun, that this world is a shadowy projection from a higher world, whereas Aristotle's saying the eternal forms are always united with the material world. So I'll leave it at that. That is what Al Gore was referring to. Are we still unconsciously following the direction of Plato's finger, looking for the sacred everywhere except in the real world? So then he goes on to say, it is my own belief that the image of God can be seen in every corner of creation, even in us, but only faintly. By gathering in the mind's eye all of creation, one can perceive the image of the Creator vividly. Indeed, my understanding of how God is manifest in the world can be best conveyed through the metaphor of the hologram, which I mentioned in the introduction. Each tiny portion of the hologram contains a tiny representation of the entire three-dimensional image, but only faintly. So I'm skipping a little. He says, by experiencing nature in its fullest, our own and that of all creation, with our senses and with our spiritual imagination, we can glimpse, bright shining as the sun, an infinite image of God. So that idea of seeing with our spiritual imagination, bright shining as the sun, an infinite image of God, even though that is presented as the antidote to Plato, it is actually the pinnacle of Plato's Cave Allegory, where he says, for example, in several places where he mentions the idea of the good, he says, even so, this organ of knowledge, he's talking about the eye of the soul, this organ of knowledge must be turned around from the world of becoming together with the entire soul until the soul is able to endure the contemplation of essence and the brightest region of being. And this, we say, is the good, do we not? So the idea of the good, he compares to the spiritual sun, of which the visible sun is a shadow, and it's the source of all of the material and the spiritual world. All of nature and all of every individual human soul, along with the souls of all of the reincarnating species, are contained in the idea of the good, which projects this three-dimensional temporary world. But the goal is to return to the horizon of the cosmos and reunite with our souls, which contain all of the absolute ideas of knowledge. Each soul is one with the infinite soul, the idea of the good, and each soul is made of all of the absolute ideas of knowledge. So the great irony here is that Al Gore is presenting this holographic image of God using language that is basically a reproduction of Plato's Cave Allegory, although he blames Plato's theory for creating the spiritual crisis that we're suffering through today. So I want to read another passage which links Al Gore to the idea of the Big Bang and the singularity, which I'm saying is the idea of the good. So on page 254 of his book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit, he says, although many scientists resist the notion that science can ever be reunited with religion, there is now a powerful impulse in some parts of the scientific community to heal the breach. While Plato tended to emphasize the eternity of existence rather than the concept of creation, and while Descartes' mechanistic explanation also implied an eternal world, many scientists who have had no use for religion in the past now believe that the evidence from recent breakthroughs in astronomy and cosmology points toward a definite beginning for the universe. Some have, as a result, softened their resistance to the notion that the universe and humankind as a part of it were created. So the scientific theory of creation is the Big Bang. The universe is expanding, which Edwin Hubble discovered in 1929, and which the Jesuit priest George Lemaitre first derived from Einstein's general theory of relativity mathematically in 1927. He pointed out to Einstein, your own theory implies that space-time is expanding. If it's expanding now, it must have been contracted in the past. Go back far enough, it must have been contracted in a primeval atom, which is the gravitational singularity. So that is consistent with Plato's cosmology. He said, Al Gore says, while Plato tended to emphasize the eternity of existence, yes, he did, but in the Timaeus, he also says, it seems most probable that God created the universe, putting the soul in its central point, which also encompasses the outermost sphere. If we equate the idea of the good with the gravitational singularity, then all of the environment-saving tendencies of Al Gore's proposed holographic theology, we find it in Plato's Cave Allegory, especially when we combine it with the Timaeus. So the final ingredient, which really nails the parallels between Plato and Susskind and Carl Jung's near-death experience, is the myth of So I'll be discussing this again in subsequent videos, but at the end of the Republic, Socrates retells a story he heard about a soldier named who woke up on his own funeral pyre just before they lit it, and he recalled what he had perceived during a journey he had from the time he died on the battlefield to the time he was revived. And the main point is he saw himself at the outermost sphere of the universe, looking down at the universe, where he saw the three fates, the sisters, the sister goddesses who represent the past, the present, and the future, interweaving each reincarnating soul's fate by weaving a thread of destiny from the outermost sphere in through the concentric spheres towards the central earth. So that thread of information tying the past, the present, and the future together is very similar to Carl Jung's near-death experience, which I think it's important to point out at the end. His near-death experience ended when his doctor, who he calls Dr. H, the primal form, he said, of Dr. H, he saw rising above the earth. To find him, at this point of his vision, he was 1,000 miles above the earth, and he was looking into a black rock temple, a hollowed out stone that was as big as his house. Inside, he saw a black Hindu. In the back, a very brilliant room with people he said he felt as if he belonged to in reality were in there. He felt if he could go into this black rock temple, he would learn about the past, present, and future. And it was from this vision that he had the impression that each of us is interwoven at the outermost horizon of the cosmos and is hung in our little box of illusion by a thread. So this entire vision stopped when he saw Dr. H rising in his primal form, and it seemed to Jung as if he had been delegated by the earth to deliver a message to me, to tell me that there was a protest against my going away. I had no right to leave the earth and must return. Then he says, now I must return to the box system again, for it seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up, in which each person sat by himself in a little box. I had been so glad to shed it all, and now it had come about that I, along with everyone else, would again be hung up in a box by a thread. So the earth personified sent Dr. H to retrieve Jung so that he wouldn't be tempted to leave our universe. Why? Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that this is true. Why would Earth try to stop Carl Jung from leaving? If you think back now to Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit, Al Gore, who received the popular vote to become president of the most powerful nation on the earth, he's saying, first of all, that Plato's to blame for our ecological crisis and that the holographic understanding of God is the solution. But as we've seen, Brian Greene himself, one of the foremost string theorists, points out the parallels between holographic string theory and Plato's Cave Allegory. And we've also seen how Gore's image of seeing God with our spiritual imagination, bright shining as the sun, reflects Plato's image in the Cave Allegory of opening the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, the most brilliant form of all, from which all other forms radiate. So if we see all of nature and ourselves interwoven at each point of this horizon of the cosmos, and that these three-dimensional, this cinematic hologram, this holographic movie, is radiating from our common unity of the mandala shape of the soul. It's the soul at the centralmost point and the outermost horizon, the spherical border of space-time. That gives us what Al Gore says we need, a sense of our unity with all other living things. So although I can see the logic in his argument that Plato's theory led to the spiritual crisis, it does make sense what he's saying. Plato did say we're separate from the material world, but he also said we're one with it, especially when you bring in his theory of reincarnation. No, the bodies that we have don't have souls, but they are themselves projections from each of our souls. The beetle, the tree, every plant, every amoeba has a soul that's reincarnating through various bodies. So Plato didn't have much respect for the physical bodies, but he had respect for the souls reincarnating through them. And he would not endorse this ecological attack on the other species just to satisfy our gluttonous appetites. He would point out that each of those material bodies has a soul, which is every bit as eternal and perfect as a soul that happens to be inhabiting a human form. Okay, so I think that is enough of a summary of this part of the book, Psyche and Singularity. And in the next video, I will show the parallels between holographic string theory and St. Augustine's cosmology, which he borrowed mainly from Plato.